Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Sam Odom. He is the director of the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, the FPG. You guys get those on your listserv. You get those announcements about all the good stuff that's going on. He's also a professor of the School of Education, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm going to talk a little bit in his introduction about the accolades because we are so honored that he is here with us today. He has written over and co-written over about 100 publications. You look really, healthy and have a lot of energy despite doing all that work. He's edited or co-edited about 10 books on early childhood intervention and developmental disabilities. And over the years, he hasn't just done autism. He's done topics related to early childhood inclusion, preschool readiness, and then eventually has focused on ASD, which has been the epicenter of his current projects. He has lots of awards, which I would have had to put about 20 slides up, but lots of honors for his teaching, his service, and his research. He's asked by congressional committees to come provide expert testimony. But it was his term on the National Academy of Sciences on educational programs for children with autism that led him to turn his attention primarily to autism. So he now heads the Pioneering Center on Secondary Education for Students with ASD, CESA, and you're going to hear more about that in a few minutes. And we have a direct link on our Captain website with that on there. And that is developing a comprehensive treatment model specifically designed for high school students. Raise your hand if you work with high school students. Yeah, so there's a lot of you. They do grow up, don't they? Isn't that amazing? We know him best, as Patty said earlier. Patty and I were on the Legislative Blue Ribbon Commission. Were there some other people in here that were on that as well? So just a few of us. So we were on there, as you know, when the families in California kind of went to their legislators and they said, you're not doing enough for children in California, and we want you to do something. And so a Legislative Blue Ribbon Commission happens when the Assembly and the Senate, and they each appoint people, and they get a big group of stakeholders and people who know about autism, and they get them together, and they say, do we have a problem in California? And if so, what should we do about that? And so we met for over a year and wrote a report. The other whisper in our ear was, we hope your recommendations don't really have any tie to money. And we go, well, they will, but we'll see. So anyway, we turned in the report. It was a fabulous report, great recommendations, lots of people all over the state who had great ideas. And then it was over. But guess what? Not to be undone. It was like this group of people were so passionate. And through the UC Davis, there was an interagency autism planning group that was developed. And then just so happens at the same time, Dr. Odom has this whole grant going on. And so it was like, oh, well, that worked out. That's kind of good timing. That's a little serendipitous. And so we joined, actually, the National Professional Development Center on Autism, which was an FPG team that trained and coached us under your auspices. And so we were being coached, like Patty and I were coaches, and we were out there, and we throughout the whole school, most of the leaders on the Captain leadership team were coached on, at the time, what are these 24 evidence-based practices, and how do you implement them with fidelity? And we were coached, and then at the end of that, it was like, well, now the grant's over, now what do we do? Oh, let's create Captain. And so, truly, Dr. Odom, you are responsible for Captain and what we know as today. So please welcome Dr. Sam Odom.
Thanks very much. So this is a little bit of a different format for me. Usually I'm standing up and talking. So I'll try to look around and see people because I usually try to do that when I'm standing up and talking. And want to thank the Project Captain program, the complete program, for one, inviting me out. I got to meet with the Project Captain teams from Southern California, that other state that you have here, in December, and I am just delighted to be able to come to the northern part of the state. Although it was a little damp last night coming in.
We have a drought here, you know.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting definition for drought. They, but I know you're glad to see the rain, and people in Southern California are too. I think Captain is very much sort of the poster. You could either call it a poster child or the best case example of how the work of the National Professional Center took hold, and the reason that it's taken hold in California and a few other states, but California is the best example, is because of these two people here and all of you. And the districts that are supporting you. I'm assuming that their children going to schools this morning. I saw kids and families going to school next door. So the fact that your district will support you to come here, I think, is a tribute to your influence within the district, and then also the district wanting to provide the kind of services that they think are important for students with autism spectrum disorders and their families. So, I just want to convey my great enthusiasm and admiration for the work that you're doing here. It's just terrific. The Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, I'll just quickly say, I'm the director. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary. The Institute began as a part of the legislation from the 1960s that John F. Kennedy was sort of the father of, that provided funding for research and development related to what was then called mental retardation, but now is more broadly developmental disability. So we were one of those early centers, now institute, that did research on work related to mental retardation at the time, intellectual disability. Our work was, at that time, focused on early childhood education, the impact of early childhood education on young children who are living in socioeconomically impoverished environments. The impact is it's actually 40 years, our follow-up data has documented those enduring changes that occur when you intervene early. Early on also, we were very committed to working with individuals, children with identifiable disabilities. So there was very much work early on that focused on early intervention, early childhood special education. Much of the work that if you work in Part C programs or early intervention programs, and your focus is more broadly on families, I think part of that influence came out of the investigators at the Frank Porter Graham Center, Don Bailey and Pam Winton, as well as our other colleagues, Carl Dunst in North Carolina, who's not part of our center but was very much a colleague. So there's been quite a bit of work related to Fragile X syndrome that came on in the 1990s and later. And when I arrived at the Frank Porter Graham Center in 2006, we began a program for research, number of programs of research and professional development that focused on autism spectrum disorders. So I became involved in the field of special education and also working with children with autism in 1975 as a teacher, 1976 as a teacher, right as now IDEA came in, and was drawn into research in my doctoral program, and then postdoc working with Phil Strain at the University of Pittsburgh. So
So yeah, we're curious about what was the motivation or the catalyst for the MPDC to go so deep into this huge ASD project.
The so so my personal motivation actually came out of work with the National Academy of Sciences. It sort of after 20 years in the field of special ed research, it refocused my work and efforts on autism spectrum disorders. When I moved to the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute in 2006, at around that same time, the Office of Special Education Programs funded the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders with the intent of promoting the use of evidence-based practices by teachers with children with autism spectrum disorders and their families. At the time, we depended on book chapters and other sources of information to translate that work from the scientific work on practices that have effects for children with autism spectrum disorders to actual information, practical knowledge that teachers could use in their programs. So the National Professional Development Center had that as its explicit goal, its mission. We began by looking around or identifying what evidence-based practice meant, because at the time people were just beginning to use the term, but there wasn't complete agreement on what that meant. And I think I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But we during those early years, we were sort of flying the plane and building it too. We were focused on designing a program that states like California could use in working with teachers. So this meeting today is like looking back in 2006, is like our ideal best case sort of outcome. That if a state were going to take hold and provide the kinds of support for teachers and using evidence-based practices, this would be sort of what it looks like. So I want to congratulate again you all for doing just that.
Dr. Odom, can you give us sort of a summary of the MPDC model and also share with us what some of your findings and outcomes were in working with the different states during that grant?
Sure. This sort of esoteric-looking model I can break down. Our model, our MPDC model, is very much the model that we follow in special education. It's specified, narrowed in its principles and its tools that we use, but it very much is aligned with what we do. It begins with identifying goals for students in an observable and measurable way. So when we work with teachers now, we spend a lot of time doing just that. And we use a system called goal attainment scaling, which we find is useful. It's not an absolutely necessary part of the system. We use it more in our evaluation work of the model. But the very key part is that it requires teachers to identify goals and specifically objectives for students in an observable, measurable way. And sometimes, as you know, that's a challenge. It also focuses on building a supportive environment where one can implement practices that can, evidence-based practices in a high fidelity way. So we developed a system, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, I think called the APERS, the Autism Program Environment Rating Scale. That system allows programs to assess the quality of their program, and we work with teachers and schools to develop a plan for improving quality to establish a receptive context for students with autism. So for example, you all may have been in programs where for children with autism, where there wasn't really a schedule, or the schedule was pretty loose. There weren't really clearly identified areas. We didn't know what the expectation. You wouldn't know what the expectations were for students. There weren't any specific plans for promoting communication or social interaction. There might have been a team, or there might not have been a team related to working with the student. So the APERS allows us to examine, observe, and quantify how well programs are doing, so that they can use that information to improve their program, and also, importantly, they can use that information to describe to other people, to parents, what the quality of their program is, which is a really, really important thing to do. The other feature of the MPDC model was to identify the evidence-based practices, which you all, being experienced captainers, know, I think, have a lot of information about right now. So I won't go into very much detail, but having those practices in an accessible, understandable format then allows a process, sort of a link in that chain between the science and the science that happens in journals and the outcomes that happen to children in your program. So that chain is, that link is between the goals that you establish and identifying the practices that work for children. So that if you have a child who is, an example, in your classroom, in a classroom, there may be a child who wanders around, who's not engaged, who maybe has tantrums, that has a lot of stereotypic behavior. The goal may be to, and state in a positive way, to promote the engagement, the engagement of the child in activities in an appropriate way. So quantifying that goal and then looking for a practice, perhaps like visual supports, is I think the linkage that we're looking for. How you quantify what the goal is, and then how you move to that set of practices that we've identified that you can use, or the teachers that you work with can use in their classroom. Having a way of implementing the practice with fidelity is important. So the materials that we develop do have checklists that allow you to see how well you or the teachers that you're working with are following the practice. So in MPDC, we were lucky to work with collaborators. A set of collaborators were actually here in California. Sally Rogers at the Mind Institute was a co-principal investigator, and with her team and Lynn Abadudo and group who was then at Wisconsin at the Weizmann Center, was the second team, had a second team of professional development staff. So together we we designed the model that that you just saw. I want to say that that we're now using that model in North Carolina. North Carolina is not one of those states that's filled in, as you can see on this slide, at the time, but we do now have an IES grant that allows us to implement that model and determine the efficacy of the MPDC model in elementary schools. You'll hear a little bit. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about implementation science in just a few minutes. But we did base, and when we wrote the application, we did base our work on the implementation science work that was just emerging at the time, as well as some of the work that other work that was in professional development that was happening at FPG. Part of the process in working with states was for the state to complete an application. So the foundation of a model like California's or Kentucky's or Indiana's was at first based on the state saying, yes, we'll agree that we'll have a group that can plan how we are going to support teachers in our state, and that plan will provide some resources for doing that. And our MPDC grant through the federal government could provide some resources for doing that. For 4 years, we had different, what we call cohorts of states, and those are highlighted in the slide that you're seeing right now, with California being in the third cohort. I can't say we had everything pinned down and we're doing everything correctly, but the fact that you all were in the third cohort was really an advantage. And in fact, if you look at those states that are in the third cohort, California, Texas, and Virginia, in all three states, there are active continuing uses of the NPDC model, as there are in many, actually quite a few of the other states, not all, but quite a few. So that uptake was, I think, anchored within the state by the state agreeing to become part of the NPDC. And actually in California, I think you all worked in northern and southern.
We did, yeah. And just keep in mind, too, that this was competitive. So when we decided to apply, we were competing against a multitude of other states who wanted the support as well. And I think a lot of the reason that California was awarded the support for those 2 years is we had the backing of DDS and the regional centers. We had the backing of the state SELPA organization, CDE Special Education Division, letters of support from the Family Resource Center Network of California.
And the diagnostic
And
centers.
the diagnostic centers from CDE, as well as the USEDS at the UC Davis Mind Institute and at USC. And so Patricia Suda, who's sitting in the back there, and I took on the role of state leads to be able to bring this training to California, and then partnered with the Diagnostic Center and the SELPAs, the regional centers, and the Family Resource Center Network to get the training and disseminate it at our demonstration sites. And we had 6 demonstration sites, 6 basically school sites, classrooms, to be able to learn to use all of these amazing tools that Dr. Odom and his team developed. But being huge and being diverse, we decided to take those sites and stretch it as far as we could. So we went from preschool to high school. We had inclusive contexts, we had self-contained contexts. We had districts that were rural and school sites that were very urban, and really tried to learn as much as we could during that 2-year period that we received the support from the MPDC. And they were amazing, monthly phone conversations, coming out, helping us learn the tools, giving us feedback about our coaching and about the work that we were doing in the classrooms. And I have to say also that we did a lot of communication and collaboration with some of the other states. Texas was a primary example because we were both going, in a state this big, how? How do we do this? What are your next steps going to be? And we spent a lot of time dialoguing with their implementation teams and sort of figuring out the next step model with Texas. So it was a really invaluable experience in California to be able to do that and to, I think, be lucky enough to come in late in the process to where a lot of these things were already, the kinks and bugs were already worked out, and we got the benefit of that. So it was a wonderful opportunity.
Again, we had to advocate too. We said, California's ginormous, and like Kentucky's this big. We're going to need 3 demonstration sites, and what that meant was we needed the MPDC coaches to be made available to the 3 different sites. But they said, okay, if that's what you want to do. So we did have our demonstration sites: Northern California, Central California, and Southern California.
These guys got a lot of air miles those 2 years.
They did.
I'm quite sure. We wanted to give you guys an opportunity at this point, before we move on to some of the other questions, to ask your questions, because we have Dr. Odom here for a short period of time, but the expertise that he brings and the experience that he has with implementing these practices and developing these resources and working with different stakeholder groups, I'm sure you probably have burning questions and things that you want to know. So we have a microphone set up right back here. Regina, will you wave your hand? And if you have a question, we'd invite you to go up to the microphone and ask. We also will have a couple of other points in our conversation with Dr. Odom for you guys to ask questions as well.
And as you listen, you may understand and know most of this, but I know probably it never happens, but you might be challenged once in a while, like, who says we're going to use these EBPs, and what's captain? And, I find it very beneficial to listen to Dr. Odom, because now I have some scripts that I can use as I go forth, and people ask me these questions from, where did all this stuff come from, and why are we doing this? So I like to so you guys might get questions in your IEPs or wherever. So here's your chance to get a social language script from Dr. Odom to help you out at your next meeting. I don't know if you want to be quoted on that, but I'm sure you measure your words carefully.
Fun film.
Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Lisa. I'm a school psychologist from a very small district in rural Lake County. And our district, actually our whole county, went Common Core. And what happened in our preschool elementary school program is that they went language rich, which was awesome, except they left visual processing. And I recently personally tested 6 kids out of 1 kindergarten class who have no visual sequencing skills whatsoever. So they're saying they're autistic, and I'm saying no. They haven't been taught, visual that. So we've been discussing in my district trying to come up with some core evidence-based practices that we could put into the curriculum room that would form a basis of structure that would go with the Common Core. And obviously we're looking at visual schedules, we're looking at social communication, we're looking at possibly group discrete trial, but I was wondering if there was something, rather than reinvent the wheel, if there was something that I could go to find that would sort of have, this would be like the basic skill set that we want to make sure we're covering.
So I think I got it. So I'm not sure I have a comprehensive program that I can direct you toward, although there are some. So are you thinking about a set of specific skills for students with autism to assist them in being successful in the academic curriculum?
What I'm envisioning is using the evidence practices that we're using with the kids on the spectrum, which we know are very effective, and expanding that into a preschool kindergarten general education class, and what would you think would be like the cornerstone ones that we'd really want to start with?
Yeah, yeah.
Does that?
Yeah, I think they, you can tell me if I'm responding in the right way, or to your question. So the 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 evidence-based practices do have a set of sort of foundational skills that are mostly based on applied behavior analysis, and so they do establish the components of other practices that are well multi-component. So those basic skills of reinforcement and prompting and uh, I think scripting, modeling, time delay are one group of skills that I would call foundational. So um, the there are a second group of skills that are, I think, situated around, or they come together into a positive behavior support and intervention kind of grouping. So those would be functional behavior assessment and antecedent interventions and differential reinforcement of other behavior, interruption and redirection. The so those are the kind of the basic skills. If we're just starting off and we only have a little bit limited amount of time, they're the kind of building blocks for other interventions. And so at the preschool level, you're talking about the preschool level, the component interventions that work well, I think, are pivotal response training, which is quite an effective intervention. If there's a emphasis on communication, that which we know many students need, functional communication training is a component, sort of a multi-component intervention. Um, social skills training is another multi-component intervention and has a wide variety of forms. I'm not sure that's getting at what you're thinking about, though.
No, that's I was spending a lot of time in the classroom, and I'm thinking, there's no.
Yeah.
One of the problems with Common Core that's happened and I think maybe in the rural level, is that we don't necessarily have the sophistication, and so our teachers are not have an overarching plan, which affects all students, and of course really affects our ASD kiddos.
Yeah.
But I was just trying to think of something that we could use to support that. And I'm thinking, so that's thank you very much.
Okay.
So that
Thanks.
question actually leads us to our next question for Dr. Odom, which was, we're going to be accessing these evidence-based practices. So we'd like to hear from him about the critical review that was conducted for determining, those evidence-based practices, and then how does it differ? Remember, there's the National Autism Center's review as well, and so how do you explain the relationship between those?
Yeah, I'd be glad to talk. And then there might be some other questions. I don't. So the two reviews that are at least that are talked about a lot in education of students with autism spectrum disorders are the National Standards panel review that the National Autism Center conducted and our NPDC review. And they have worked very much evolved very much in parallel. The National Standards Project began in the early 2000s, 2003 or 4. Were you all part of that? Yeah. And actually, I became part of it because Susan Wilczynski was part of the Blue Ribbon panel, I think. If we're talking about the same panel. So I was, when I was here in California, and it preceded NPDC. When we and we became involved in doing some of the reviews. We eventually published a paper on comprehensive treatment models and sort of a review of those that came out of the National Standards Project work. So when we started to build the NPDC model that you're using now, the National Standards Project had not published their research, has not published their review. And in fact, we're just in the process of doing that. So we had written into our application we were going to use the National Standards Project information in our work. But this was 2007, 2000, and we had to get going. And their review was large and comprehensive, but it did take a long time, and it did take a long time to do. So we did a smaller, more focused review on interventions that were appropriate for school-age children. So one of the characteristics, one of the criteria was that you had to be able to do this in a school or community setting, this meaning an intervention in a school or community setting. Our review went from 1997 to 2007, so it was just a 10-year review. And it met a set of criteria that were a little different from the National Standards Project, but still identifiable, rigorous evaluations of articles. The National Standards Project incorporated studies that went all the way back to when research on autism spectrum disorder began, which is in the 70s or 80s, and went up to 2007. So we had a smaller chunk of that. As time passed, more research was done. There were more practices that came online in the sense of people using them. There was a need to expand that review. So we did a second review that was published in 2014. They also did a second review. Our review, again, kept at that birth to 22 age range. Their review, and it added studies. So from our studies now, we incorporated from 1990 up through 2011. Theirs continued to cover the whole history. And they both of the reviews came out at about the same time. So what happened with our review? We initially identified 24 practices that we felt like met the criteria for evidence-based. In the second review, we found that when we used a more rigorous evaluation of studies, some of the practices fell out that were in there before. So, for example, independent work systems did fall out. Which, if we did review again today, they would be back in because there are other studies that have been done. The National Standards Project, in the second review, we have 27 practices that were identified, and the National Standards Project also added practices that previously had not had a sufficient level of quality or amount of evidence to be called evidence-based. So we did compare those. We did look at that's magic. So in this small slide that actually, if you can see it from the back, you have extraordinary eyesight.
It's on the wall, though, huge.
Yeah. Oh well, that might help. So we were interested. We had done this with the first set of practices that were published in 2010. both of our first reviews were published around then. And then looked again at the 2 sets that were published in 2014-15, and found that there's a lot of overlap between the 2 reviews, which both the National Standards Project and NPDC were really delighted about that. So so if you see this first, I'm going to try not to change this slide too much. It's a very sensitive instrument here. In this column are the practices that were identified by NPDC. In this row are the practices that were identified by the National Standards Project. And those cells that you see are where the overlap was. So the National Standards Project identified a lot of behavioral interventions, but they grouped them all together into behavioral intervention. For us, when we're working with teachers, we really needed to have those broken out so that we could address those individually with teachers, and they could individually link those behavioral interventions, specific behavioral interventions, to the goals for children. But we did find overlap for many of the practices, most of the practices actually. There were some that appeared in our list of practices that weren't in the National Standards Project. So there were 21 in which there was direct overlap. For NPDC, we identified practices that the National Standards Project called emerging practices, functional communication, training, behavior, PECs, exercise, and then technology-assisted instruction, which changed a little bit in terms of how we define that in our second set of practices. And then we identified a couple that were not identified by the National Standards Project: structured playgroups and functional behavioral assessment. NSP identified one practice that we didn't have. It was called language training. But when you look at that practice, it includes a number of the features that we've included in other categories, like, for example, milieu language training is incorporated into our naturalistic intervention model. Okay.
Hi, Dr. Odom. I am Sorrel Markowitz. I'm the Autism and Behavior Specialist at Westside Regional Center. And my question comes about adults. The work that has been done so far has really focused on children, and earlier, as you were discussing the differences, you were mentioning the research going all the way up to the age of 22. So we have now so many requests for behavioral services to our, as Patty and Ann have put it really well, our autism folks are growing up, and we weren't prepared for them to grow up. Somehow we didn't really think about that happening, but there are so many changes and so many requests for behavioral support for people who are over the age of 22 that I'm really wondering about whether there's a plan to expand any of the research to adults so that we have a better understanding of what differences there may be in using evidence-based practice to serve their needs.
Yes, it's a really important question. I was at the Interagency Autism Coordinating Council last week, and it's a committee that examines all the research and development intervention work that's happening that's funded by the federal government. And one of the proposals, one of the statements that they've made repeatedly is, or at least repeatedly over the last couple of years, was how important it is that we refocus some of the work that's happening at the federal level on adults with autism, recognizing that this generation that first got into early intervention, they're leaving right now and moving into communities, and hopefully some are moving into the workforce, they're certainly moving out of high school. So they're in the services on the adult end are not well defined. The evidence-based practices are sort of unclear what they are. Although the National Standards Project did pull into in the adult literature, and one of the things that I think they found was that there's not a great deal of adult literature. So for our work, our MPDC work, we are just at the beginning of starting what we call a national clearinghouse on autism practice and evidence. As part of that clearinghouse, we'll also pull in the adult literature, and in the expansion of our evidence-based practices in the future, it'll include that adult literature. So we'll hopefully be elaborating on that.
Thank you.
I think it was really helpful in this last iteration of the National Standards report that they did include adults. But you mentioned earlier that they sort of lumped everything under one category, behavioral treatments or behavioral interventions. And to me, the ideal for training adult providers is to have a similar model to what you've offered us with the MPDC, where things are more specific, broken down with fidelity checklists, and it's made it so usable. And so if you have any influence on the direction that takes, I think that would be really helpful for those who are working with and training providers of adults as well. What do you guys think?
So this is on the Captain website. So when people come to you and they say, wait, there's these two sources, this is on the Captain website for you to use in your conversations as well. And so we know another question that everyone is posed with is you get presented by people who say, well, I want to use this practice or this method. And so we have to be able to respond with, what counts as evidence, what makes an evidence-based practice an evidence-based practice. And so we wanted to ask you, what's the criteria for that? Because I think, raise your hand if you're in a room at some point in your job meeting with people who are talking about how to treat or provide interventions or instructional strategy to your clients or students. Yeah. And how many of you get faced with a question of something that's questionable and they go, why can't we use this? So here's your social language script.
So the criteria that we use are portrayed up here. So we believe that, and a lot of the field is consistent with this, that the evidence needs to come from published research articles that have been peer reviewed. So they've been through the scientific vetting process. Those articles need to be evaluated again. We can't just depend on reviewers of journals. We need whoever is establishing evidence-based practices needs to have a second methodological review to see if studies are acceptable. That there need to be at least 2 high-quality experimental design, group design studies, or 5 high-quality single case design studies. And so one of the pushbacks we get from the medical community is that, well, single case design study, we're not sure about those. You just do a study with like one person and you're going to say it's an evidence-based practice. With single case design, it is an experimental procedure. It almost always involves 2 or 3 or more individuals, but even in itself, one study is limited. So the evidence has to come from replication across studies and by different research groups. So there's not just one researcher that's done 5 studies, and it hasn't been replicated anywhere. all of those studies need to at least have 20 participants, if you accumulate across all the 5 studies, or that there be a combination of those with 1 group design, 3 single case design. So this is very much aligned with in the past what the field, clinical psychology, for example, has identified as being evidence-based. So one of the things that has happened in the last year is that there's a new act called ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, that has replaced the No Child Left Behind Act. So the problem is that they have both weakened and ignored criteria that the field has established in the past. So, and they use evidence-based a lot now. It's used throughout the act. So they propose that an evidence-based practice can be validated by a single study. And I won't go into the great detail about the research methodology. So a single group design study that's well designed, and they also allow some correlational studies to be used. So the issue, one of the problems, is that it's lowered the standard for what could be included. So if there is a controversial practice that has gone through peer review, has been published, it's now possible, so the one study is done by one research group. It's possible that this could be brought up as an evidence-based practice. They also left out single case design as an acceptable methodology. They do have a provision that evidence-based practices could also be demonstrated by a rationale based on high-quality research findings or positive evaluation that such activity, strategy, and intervention is likely to improve student outcomes. So that, in a way, it allows evidence-based practice to be included, or it allows single-case design to be included as evidence-based practice, but also opens the door more broadly. So as a field, what we're trying to propose is to put some definition behind what we mean by high-quality research findings. And we've been working with CEC, the Division for Research, to establish a statement that would specify more clearly how to interpret this second definition for special education research specifically. So that's still sort of unfolding. Anne was able to find the code, which essentially says a statement of special education-related services and supplemental aids and services based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable should be provided to the student. So it makes a commitment to scientifically based, evidence-based practices, although it leaves the specification sort of open as to what that is. Yeah, please.
Hi, I have another question. I'm Regina Reed. I'm director with the Ventura County SELP. I'm here as part of the leadership. As we've heard Patty reference a couple times, the EBPs and all the tools have been a great tool for us, a resource for people when we're at these IEPs and fostering that collaboration between families and our agencies that we work with. But we're starting to wonder, would this kind of model be beneficial with some other disabilities, specifically dyslexia and ADHD? And are there any plans to kind of take this model into other disabilities?
The first answer is yes, I believe it would be. And when we work with schools, we talk about the application of the practices with students who may have other disabilities other than autism. We can't, because our review just focused very specifically on students with autism, we can't say for a fact that that they would also be effective with others, but of course they would. They're very basic instructional and intervention procedures. So with expanding to ADHD and dyslexia, the work like this is very dependent on funding. So we can't do anything without having either a foundation or a federal government provide funding for us, because we operate all completely off of grants. So to the extent, and there have been foundations that have focused on ADHD in the past. So that could be a possible direction for them. I think with the law, I think it's going to happen.
And it's a really good opportunity for you guys to even think about how we were able to get the support for the MPDC project here in California. And it was because of letters of support. So if there is a research institution that approaches your school district or approaches your agency and says, hey, we're interested in doing this study, but we need support, we need partners, we need collaborators to be able to do it, you'd be really amazed what showing that level of collaboration does to receiving the funding that's needed to do the work. So don't be afraid to partner with the universities, because it's a really valuable way that we can get things out into practice faster and work with our communities to be able to figure out what works.
So we have 15 minutes. Do we want to do this question or move on to implementation?
I think implementation. So we want to know what the key lessons learned have been. You did this work with multiple states, not just in California. You've been doing it now in North Carolina. You've got a secondary model that you're implementing. What are some of the key lessons learned about how to actually get these things in practice and implement them effectively in public settings?
So I mentioned that we did base our original NPDC project on the principles of implementation science. And implementation science has emerged as a major force in the field. Dean Fixon and the NERN group at FPG now are one of the groups that have moved evidence-based practices through implementation science. They work with a number of states right now. So that issue around scaling up, I think, is a very important one. And Dean has a very simple formula that if you want to achieve educational outcomes, one backs it up through first identifying what the effective instruction is, which we propose happens through the evidence-based practices, that using those with a high degree of fidelity and having a support system that allows teachers to be able to learn how to use evidence-based practices and then use them in their work is important. And then the enabling contexts are just that support system, that you have supervisors, or you are supervisors who provide the kind of recognition, the permission, like coming here today, to be able to implement those practices. And Dean Fixon and Carol Blasey and group do talk about how with any formula, if there is a zero in any of those slots, then the whole sum becomes zero. So it really depends on all of the features. I'll go quickly through this because there are other things I'm hoping we're going to get to in the next 12 minutes. So that implementation of a model takes time, beginning with exploration, which is just learning about the practice. So when California was thinking about becoming part of the NPDC network, they would have the state leadership team would examine very closely what it's going to take to actually move a system like this in place. And when they decided to do it, they moved to this installation stage where there's actually workshops, there was training that occurred, there was a plan that was established for how model classrooms would be distributed across the state, and then how they would be supported. That led to sort of an initial implementation in those model classrooms. And I don't know if you all feel like you're at full implementation now. In a way, we never get to full implementation. But this is your presence here today is a great example, again, I'll mention, of how California's got to the place where there's two very large groups of teachers, Southern and Northern, or I'll say Northern and Southern, that are doing just that, are moving forward in creating effective instruction for children with autism. So who are those leaders? I think that example of leading from the rear, I
Where
guess?
you are. Or the rear.
Yeah, probably leading from the middle is a good term. It's a great metaphor. So in some of the research in general education that has examined how research becomes employed in school districts, in elementary school districts or high school districts, the key people appear to be the middle level administrators, that is directors of special education, supervisors of autism programs, sometimes principals or assistant principals. A champion within a school or a district is critical. So if one is not a middle level administrator, often teachers come to the forefront, and they are so enthusiastic and can speak so positively about how things have worked in their classroom and with their students. They influence what happens. They influence administrators. So that grassroots, I think, advocacy cannot be understated, and especially if there are family allies, families that have seen the positive impact for their children. I think those are critical elements that one can take. You as a teacher, one as a teacher or an administrator can take forward to a superintendent to talk about what is actually happening.
So I think that really goes back to the notion of leading from where you are. And if you don't have full support to go and be a trainer of trainers and coach all these teachers and use the fidelity measures, but you can influence just one teacher who's then going to be the champion, that's going to go to the administrator, the site principal, and get them on board, the research is really showing that can have a huge ripple and a huge impact. If you are that middle manager, you are that person that is the champion, then maybe you'll be able to move things a little bit quicker. But one really motivated person can make a huge difference and really start some things happening.
I was listening to the radio in the rain driving here, and it was someone who studies change. And he said very rarely is change just this one moment of, wow, look what they did. He said even when they award the Nobel Prizes, it really wasn't about one moment in time, but it was a series of small incremental steps and incremental teeny tiny change that finally led to peace or the discovery of something. And so we have to continue to talk to ourselves and work as teams, knowing that the littlest thing that you made a difference with is going to build upon that to keep making the bigger change that you'll realize later that seems, bigger and more out loud. But in the meanwhile, these tiny changes are critical to, the final big moment where you go, wow. And I agree. I don't think we feel like we're at full implementation, but we sure love your accolades that we've accomplished a lot, the group.
One other thing that Dr. Odom had on the slide there was the National Implementation Research Network, Resource Network, NIRN. Great online training modules on implementation science. And so for you guys to build your understanding of that, it's really taking off in California as a way of being able to make systemic change. I know that it's a component of the MTSS model that they're using to try to scale up across the state. PBIS relies a lot on implementation science. So educating yourselves about the stages of implementation and the different resources that NERN has developed. But also, it could be something that you could share with the upper level administrators to help them understand the research and the science behind change.
Are there questions or comments? Yeah, please.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jennifer Fisher from the Southwest SELPA area down south, and I had a question regarding, in California, we've begun translating some of the NPDC resources into Spanish, starting with the EBP chart. Are there any other states or programs that you know of who are also working on these types of translations? Would there be any interest by the NPDC and ASD to partner with us to do this important translation work?
Yeah, thanks. I'm really excited about hearing that you're translating. We are in our NPDC work. We have not translated modules because we didn't have the resources to do that. We are working. In North Carolina, we're working with some schools that have a Latino population and are doing some translation, but not on a consistent program basis. For our high school model, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, we have been doing a lot of translation, and that we're implementing it in the San Diego area. So the materials, many of the materials that we use for that project are now going to be in Spanish, but we're still just in the midst of that. So your question, would we be interested? We certainly would be interested. I think for us, as I mentioned, it's always a challenge to find funding to support our staff to be able to be involved in any of the work that we do. So that would be the challenge, but sure. So please get in touch. I wanted to briefly talk about the high school work that we're doing because I saw all the many of the hands go up when there was a question about who works with high school students. So about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, the Institute of Education Science funded a Center on Secondary Education for Students with Autism, which we have now. The purpose of that funding was to develop a comprehensive treatment model for high schools to use for students with autism. And we used NPDC as the basis for that model. But it became apparent that there were features of the high school environment and high school programs that we wanted to enhance. So there are four features that are placed sort of on top of the NPDC model and actually incorporate the evidence-based practices that we've identified. One focuses on literacy. So we adapted work that other people have done with either intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities. So we use Sharon Vaughn's work to use for the collaborative strategic reading model, which is adapted for ASD, and they're doing more work on adapting that model now. And then the alternative literacy work that Diane Broder has done at Charlotte is another kind of part of that model. We have a second feature that focuses on personal responsibility and independence, which we call PRISM. It's our acronym. And I'm sorry I didn't bring slides for those. But if you go to our website, which you see right here, you'll be able to pull off information about each of those models. So PRISM begins with an assessment that of important instructional outcomes for high school students with ASD, and then uses that to in our NPDC way to link those important outcomes to specific practices that can be used in high school. So it's very much the NPDC model. A third part is on social competence, and we're using the work that Janine Steechster did, and then some peer network work. And then the fourth focuses on transition, using some of the work that Dave Test has done in work-based learning, as well as transitioning together, a great program for families. So, so I'll just refer you to that website.
Dr. Odom, you'd mentioned that there's a team in San Diego that's working on this, and I'm wondering if they might be ready to share some of their outcomes at next year's summit. Are they at that point of implementing that they might be interested?
Yeah, they, sure.
Well, then we will see what we can do to.
Nothing like having him on stage being videotaped
Yeah.
and asking
He
him
just
our
committed
questions.
you guys.
Right. I'll certainly commit my colleagues down in San Diego to do that. But a word about outcomes. We are in the 5th year now, so what we can present, there's no problem presenting, are the procedures and processes. And we will just be starting to having our outcomes analyzed at that point. So I don't know how much efficacy information we can present, but.
Okay, well, we'll stay in touch on that, because I think, based on the hands in here, I think there would be a really big interest in learning from what you guys have learned and working with the secondary group.
So we've run out of time.
I want to make a last statement. I really I want to repeat what I said earlier about the importance of your work and the importance of the work that you do over the next 2 days. I'm sorry the boot camp people are not here. It would have been.
But it's being videotaped for them to
Oh,
be able to watch.
Yes, yep. So so it's always I think a pleasure to come out here. I unfortunately had to get the last plane out of Oakland to get back to North Carolina, but it leaves about 1:30, so I'm going to be jetting out of here. But I do want to wish you all just a terrific conference. I can already see getting off to a good start. So.